Okay, folks. So we're going to end this lecture on elasticity by talking about a little thing called the tax incidence. So the kind of tax that we're talking about over here would be something along the lines of a sales tax that is added to the price of a good. Maybe there was a good that didn't have a sales tax before, and now they're adding a tax to that. Or maybe there's a good that had a slight sales tax, and we're adding something more to that. So the point of this whole exercise is to show you that whenever we impose a sales tax on the market, um, the consumer will pay a portion of it. Don't let anybody, don't let any politician tell you we're going to increase taxes on this and you, Mr. and Ms. Consumer, are not going to have to pay for it. That's complete and total nonsense. Anytime a sales tax is imposed on the market, the consumer and the producer will probably split that tax somehow. Now, how will they split it? That depends on the relative elasticity of demand and to the relative elasticity of supply. So we've got four potential cases. One is where the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply are both relatively elastic relative to one another. In a case like this, if the tax is imposed on the market, it'll get split pretty close to 50-50 between consumers and producers. I'm not going to say it's going to get split exactly 50-50, but when you have a relatively elastic demand coupled with a relatively elastic supply, it should get split more or less evenly. Now, if you impose even a small tax on a market like this, then you're going to see a large decrease in the new quantity as a result of a small tax. Why is that? Because consumers are price sensitive and producers are price sensitive. Another possibility is that we might have a relatively inelastic demand coupled with a relatively inelastic supply. If a tax is imposed on this market, it'll probably again get split more or less 50-50. Again, I'm not saying exactly 50-50, but it'll get split more or less evenly because consumers are not price sensitive and producers are also not price sensitive. However, the difference between these two is that if both demand and supply are relatively inelastic, you can impose a relatively large tax on this market and you're not going to see much of a reduction in quantity as a result of a large tax because neither consumers nor producers are very price sensitive. Another possibility would be that the demand curve for a good is relatively elastic and the supply curve for a good is relatively inelastic. In a case like this, if a tax is imposed, if a sales tax is imposed on the market, the producer will wind up paying the lion's share. Why is that? Because consumers are price sensitive. When the producer tries to push this tax onto the consumer says, "Hey, wait a minute, I don't need to buy this thing. I can this is a luxury good. I can spend my luxury dollars some other way, or I don't even have to buy this good." So if you're trying to get me to pay this tax, I'm not doing that. If you want to pay the tax, that's fine. All right, then the final example is a demand curve that is relatively inelastic and a supply curve that's relatively elastic. In a case like this, consumers are the ones who are not price sensitive and producers are price sensitive. So if a tax is imposed on this market, the producer will have an easy time getting the consumer to pay the lion's share of that tax. In fact, we will look at that one first. By the way, I'm making these videos right around the time that, if you're following the news, Harley Davidson Motorcycles mentioned that they're going to move their production of bikes that they're going to sell, motorcycles that they're going to sell in Europe to someplace else offshore because we're in the middle of kind of a trade war. I would argue that probably the reason they're doing that is because they probably face a situation that's close to this, right? Why? What do I mean by that? A Harley Davidson motorcycle in Europe is probably a luxury good. The demand for that is probably relatively elastic. And their supply is probably relatively inelastic, meaning they're probably doing all they can to keep up with demand. So they know that if a tax, a tariff is a tax, and it's a tax per each motorcycle being imported. if that kind of a thing is imposed on motorcycles, if consumers are price sensitive, they're not going to pay it. So I guess they figure if we're going to have to pay the bulk of the tax anyway, we may as well start making motorcycles in another country so that we can get around that tariff. All right, so what happens when a tax is imposed on the market? So imagine that there's no special tax anyway, on ice cream, or imagine that there's no tax at all on ice cream. And imagine that somebody is upset at ice cream. Why would anybody be upset at ice cream? Well, how about the obesity epidemic? I mean, there are some people who maybe want to increase the price of sugary foods or junk food because it's contributing to the obesity epidemic. And imagine they decide that we're going to increase the price, we're going to impose a tax on every scoop of ice cream. How do we model it using our supply and demand model? All right, so imagine that in the market without a tax, consumers are paying PE and producers are receiving PE. The way we're going to model this is by shifting the supply curve back by the amount of the tax. We can do the same with the demand curve. I find it easier to just stick to the supply curve because it's the same analysis, but when you look at how most taxes are collected, they're collected by the seller. They're collected by the producer, right? If for instance there was a special tax on socks, but it wasn't collected by the seller of socks. It's kind of the honor system. You know, you have to pay, let's say, 10 cents per pair of socks that you buy. The government would never collect anything, right? We'd all be telling them that we're going around barefoot. Nope, never bought any socks this year. Nobody bought socks. Nobody pays. So what typically happens is when a tax is imposed on the market, the producer, the seller collects a tax. So we'll go ahead and shift the supply curve to the left by the amount of the tax. What's happening as a result of this? Well, the price that the consumer is going to pay is going to be way up here. It's not going to be PE anymore. It's going to be this price way up here. In order to get what is left over for the producer after he sent that tax money to the government. Remember, he's just collecting the tax. That money does not belong to him. That's going to Uncle Sam or whoever. We have to, in order to get the amount that the producer's going to keep after the tax, we've got to go down to the original supply curve and then over to the price axis. So now one of the things you'll notice is that the price the consumer pays is not the same as the price the producer receives. We've driven this thing called a tax wedge in between these two different prices. So the consumer's seeing a higher price, the producer's seeing a lower price after the tax. The other thing that's happened is that the new quantity has been reduced. So imagine that QE was the equilibrium quantity that existed before the tax was imposed. The price is now that the consumer pays is way up here. As a result, consumers are only going to demand this much. So the new quantity post-tax is going to be Q tax. Does that make sense? All right, so now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the tobacco tax. So what I'm saying over here is that the demand for tobacco, the demand for cigarettes is relatively inelastic and the supply is relatively elastic. Why do I mention that? Because if you have ever talked to anybody who smoked for a long amount of time, many years, they'll tell you it's very hard to quit. I've heard that quitting smoking is harder than quitting a lot of other things, a lot of other substances. So that's why I'm saying the demand curve is relatively inelastic. And then if you think about what it takes to produce one more cigarette, the supply curve has to be relatively elastic. I mean, the only thing it takes a tobacco company to produce one more cigarette is a little bit of paper, a little bit of tobacco, and a fiberglass filter. And when they're cranking out billions and billions of cigarettes a year, we're probably talking about something that costs fractions of a penny to make one additional cigarette. So in a case like this, if a tax is imposed on the market, again, how are we going to model it? We're going to shift the supply curve to the left. We're going to come all the way up here where the new supply curve meets the demand curve. The amount that we're shifting the supply curve by is the amount of the tax. So if, let's say, this is represented a 50 cent a pack increase in the price of tobacco or a dollar tax on a pack of tobacco, then we'd shift it by $1. and the smoker's going to wind up paying a price way up here. What are we going to do now? We're going to go down to the original supply curve and then over to the price axis, and this is the amount that the tobacco company is going to receive after the tax has been imposed. So this triangle, I don't know, I hope you can see this. This triangle over here represents the tax wedge. That's the difference between the price that the smoker pays and the price that the tobacco company receives. All right, so what about total revenue? In a case like this, would total revenue to the tobacco company decline? And the answer is, in the short run, it would not. Why is that? Because very few people are going to quit smoking. Now, that doesn't mean that in the long run it won't decline. What'll happen in the long run is fewer young people will take up smoking. That's exactly what the tobacco tax has done. It's increased the price of a pack of cigarettes by so much that now teenagers don't think about smoking tobacco because it's so expensive. Back in my time, when I was a teenager, when I was a teenager young adult, tobacco didn't cost so much, so people took up smoking a lot more, even though they knew it was bad for them. A lot of people knew it was bad for them, but they took it up anyway because cigarettes weren't that expensive. Now I hear they're like $8 a pack or something ridiculous like that. A lot of young people, these are, when you're a teenager, that's when you start forming your habits. A lot of young people, if they think about smoking, they say, "No, it's not worth it. Not tobacco anyway. Maybe at these prices I'll smoke pot instead or something like that. I don't know." But anyway, so what happens is, in the short run, because very few people are going to quit, you're not going to see much of a decrease in total revenue. In the long run, as fewer people take up smoking, you probably will see a decrease in total revenue. All right, what about the tax revenue that's collected by this type of a tax? Well, the tax revenue going to the government is the tax per pack. Well, how do we figure that out? If we take the price that the smoker is paying after the tax is imposed, and we go all the way down to what the tobacco company is receiving per pack after the tax is imposed, then this distance on the price axis is the tax per pack. What we have to do now is multiply that by the new number, the new quantity of taxes that are being bought after the tax is imposed. That would be Q post-tax. And all of this over here would be tax revenue going to the government for a tax of this size, whatever that happens to be. All right, what about who pays the tax? Remember, the seller of this pack of cigarettes is just collecting the tax. It's passing through his hands and going to Sacramento or wherever it's going. He's just a collector of the tax. Well, because the demand curve is relatively inelastic and the supply curve is relatively elastic, the smoker is going to be paying the lion's portion of this tax. How do we figure that out? We go to the price that the smoker is paying after the tax is imposed, and we compare that to the price that the smoker was paying before the tax was imposed, and this is the smoker's portion of each pack of the tax that he's paying on each pack of cigarettes. Then if we multiply that times the number of new packs that are being sold after the tax is imposed, we get the smoker's portion. All right, what about the tobacco company? Well, the tobacco company will pay everything above what they get to keep after the tax is imposed and below what they used to get to keep before the tax was imposed. And so in a case like this, we would see that it's not really all that much. The tobacco companies were against the tobacco tax not because it was going to reduce their total revenue significantly in the short run or because they were going to pay a big portion of the tax, but they were against it because they knew in the long run it was going to significantly reduce their total revenues. And that's probably a good thing. All right, another example of a tax would be the security tax. So after 9/11, the government and the airlines said that, look, people are afraid to fly. We need to restore confidence in the amount of security that we provide to the air traveling public. Private security firms, I guess, were not doing, or a lot of people felt anyway, that they weren't doing a good job. And so they decided that this would have to be nationalized. So they created TSA. You guys, anybody know what TSA stands for? TSA stands for thousands standing around, right? You go fly on a plane and you go through security and there's a whole bunch of people standing around. Very few of them are really paying attention. It seems that way anyway, paying attention to what's going on. No, I'm just kidding, but there are times when you're like saying to yourself, okay, how is this any more secure than it was before? I mean, is anybody really even looking at the x-rays? Anybody really looking at the machine or anything? All right, so how is this? How is TSA funded? It's funded by a tax on each ticket that people buy to travel by plane. So it's something like a $12 tax or something like that. Now, what I'm modeling over here for air travel is a demand curve that's relatively elastic and a supply curve that's relatively elastic. So why do I say that the demand curve is relatively elastic? The reason I'm saying that is because more and more what you're finding when you travel by plane is that the people on the plane are traveling for pleasure. In the old days, it used to be that maybe half or more of the people traveling on a plane were traveling on business. These are people who are using the company account. The company's paying for it. It's very important that they fly out there. Maybe they're flying last minute to try to deal with an emergency or put out a fire somewhere or something like that. And the company doesn't really care how much they're paying. Those people or business travel has declined significantly with the things like the internet, things like video conferencing, email, all these other ways of communicating. It's got to be very, very important these days for you to fly on business because it's just it takes so much time that and there's other ways of solving problems that really, if you can avoid traveling, you're better off. So because more and more people are pleasure travelers, the demand curve is going to be more elastic. If you're a pleasure traveler and it's too expensive to go from point A to point B, maybe you'll do something else. Maybe you'll take a road trip. Maybe you won't go anywhere. Maybe you'll take a staycation or whatever. I'm saying the supply curve is relatively elastic because if you think about what all is involved in air travel, you've got this plane, this big metal tube. It's scheduled to leave at a certain time. There's a certain number of seats that are already sold. The clock is ticking towards departure. How much would it cost the airline to put one additional behind in the seat? And the answer is basically the additional jet fuel that person's going to burn. So if that person weighs, let's say, I don't know, 175 pounds, and he's bringing 25 pounds of luggage, the airplane has got to move 200 pounds of additional weight. How much extra jet fuel is it really going to burn? So there's a big push to make sure that they get as many behinds and seats so that the planes all fly full. And so, it doesn't really cost all that much more these days, especially since you're not getting a meal. It doesn't cost all that much more to fly one more person. All right, so what happens in a case where a small tax is imposed on a market where the demand is relatively elastic and the supply is relatively elastic? You will see a big decrease in total revenue. Why is that? Because again, consumers are price sensitive and producers, suppliers are also price sensitive. So there'll be a big decrease in total revenue. In other words, this box over here represented total revenue before the tax, before this TSA tax. And now this box over here represents total revenue after this tax was imposed on the market. Okay, what about the amount of money that the government is going to collect in tax revenue for TSA? Again, it's the tax per seat, which is the difference between what the passenger pays and what the airline gets to keep after they've collected the tax and sent it to Washington, times the new quantity of seats, the new number of seats that the air traveling public is buying after the tax is imposed. So all of this is tax revenue for TSA. All of this is money that's going to get you to take your shoes off and take your computer out of your bag and da 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 da. That's all because every time somebody travels, you don't even notice. You don't even know that you're paying like whatever $12 for $12 in tax to pay for this. All right, what about the split? Well, again, the passenger is going to pay everything above the old price, the free market price. That's before this tax was imposed. The passenger was paying PFM, and the airline was also receiving PFM. But now the airline's trying to push. Just imagine that this movement from this supply curve to this supply curve is the airline physically trying to push this tax onto the passenger, and the passenger will wind up paying this price over here. So the difference between these two times the number of seats that passengers are buying after the tax is imposed is the passenger's portion. What about the airline? Well, the airline will be paying this portion over here. So this is the tax per seat that the airline is paying. If you multiply that times the number of seats that passengers are buying after the tax is imposed, then we get the airline's portion. Does that make sense? And finally, we'll end it with looking at a luxury tax that was imposed back in the late 80s, early 1990s on luxury goods. If you take the people imposing this tax, the people in Congress who were for it, at face value, they say they were doing it because they didn't want people to spend their money on frivolous things. Frivolous things like a boat, like I think jewelry was subject to luxury tax, or furs, or all these other things. So how are we modeling this? We're saying, imagine that we're talking about boats, okay? We're talking about new boats. The demand curve is going to be relatively elastic. Why do I say that? Because it's a luxury good. By definition, it's not something anybody needs. I mean, you buy a pleasure boat like a sailboat or a power boat or something like that because you want to. You don't. Very few people who own, like, let's say a power boat, a luxury power boat, or a sailboat, do it because they have to. Very few people need to. And then what I'm saying over here is that the supply curve is relatively inelastic. So then the question is, why would the supply curve be relatively inelastic? So think about what a boat is for a moment. A boat has all these funky shaped things. Nothing on a boat is square and parallel and straight or anything like that. Everything on a boat has these funky concave shapes that are rounded, designed to provide the least amount of surface area and friction. It's hard to build. So if you're in the business of making boats, you have a lot of tooling that is specially designed for you to build funky shaped things. That tooling will do you no good in making furniture. You're not going to be able to switch out of boat building and go into making cars or making anything else for that matter. So if you're a boat builder, you're pretty much locked into making boats. So that's why I'm saying the supply curve is relatively inelastic. So in a case like this, if a tax is imposed on the market, even if it's a small tax, it's going to lead to a big decrease in total revenue. The boat builder, again, will try to push this off onto the boat buyer, but the boat buyer is saying, hey, I don't need to buy this. This is not a need. This is a want. This is something I want to get, but I don't need to get it. And the boat builder will say, okay, I get it. And I don't need to, make you pay too much. I'll eat the rest of the tax. So we come over here to get the new price that the yachty's going to pay. We come down here to the original supply curve and then over to the price axis. And then this is how much the boat builder gets to keep after the tax has been paid. All right, so there's a pretty big drop in total revenue. You can see that over here. This blue area over here was total revenue before the tax was imposed, and this maroonish area over here is total revenue after the tax is imposed. All right, what about the split of this tax? Well, again, the yachty is going to pay everything above the old free market price and below the new price, times the number of boats he chooses to buy. So the yachty share of the tax is going to be this much. The boat builder is going to pay the lion's share in a case like this. Why is that? Because this is the old free market price. This is the price that the boat builder gets to. This is what the boat builder gets to keep after after he pays the tax, gives it over to Uncle Sam. If we multiply that times the number of boats that people are buying, then we get the yacht owner's portion. Okay, but there's one other group of people that we have really not taken into consideration. This is from a boat builder that made sailboats, and this is from their old website. They've changed it since then. and they were talking about how the luxury tax impacted them. And one of the things that happened was this boat builder, Tartan, had two factories, one in North Carolina and one in Ohio. And they were both making sailboats, and demand fell enough so that they consolidated operations in their Fairport, Ohio facility. They closed down the one in North Carolina, and the people in North Carolina lost their jobs. That's what's happening right now as a result of this increase in tariffs that the European Union has imposed on Harley Davidson motorcycles. You know, they're saying to themselves, look, and in fact, they closed down. I guess Harley had a factory in Kansas where they were making bikes, and they were deciding they were going to consolidate operations anyway. If they're going to close down that factory, and why not open up one up in Europe so then they can get around the tax? And so I don't see how it's creating jobs, but that's a different story. So one of the things I just want you to keep in mind is whenever a tax is imposed on the market, if it's something along the lines of a sales tax, the buyer and the seller are probably going to split it. And there are also unintended but not unpredictable consequences with respect to other people who also might wind up getting saddled with this tax. All right, folks, thanks a lot. I will be posting these videos and some others to come as well. Thank you.